Hey, this is Jeremy, and today we're going to be talking about fatigue and EMS. Fatigue and EMS is something that a lot of us are probably going to be dealing with on some level. And the definition that they use for fatigue is it's a subjective range of symptoms that range from tiredness to exhaustion that interfere with the individual's ability to operate at a normal capacity. So what it means by subjective is that it's going to affect each and every person differently. So what I feel when I'm fatigued may not necessarily be the same thing that whenever you're fatigued, and that's kind of where we're getting at. Now, there was this project that was done by NASEMSO, which is the National Association of EMS officials. Now, what they did was they did a study to help kind of develop these recommendations for mitigating fatigue, and so to minimize the fatigue that we experience working in this industry. Now, what they did was it was a three-phase type study, and so what they did was the first phase they evaluated the quality of evidence pertinent to the subjects that I'm about to lay out for you to figure out, are they actually relevant? Do they have any bearing when it comes to minimizing fatigue? Phase two, it aims to look at these recommendations that we lay out, and do they actually have any benefit to minimizing fatigue or mitigating that fatigue? Now, phase three, their goal is to actually develop a freely available program, or biomathematical model, that's what they call it, for EMS administrators while they're creating shift schedules. So what they are going to do is they're going to have this model available, and it's going to take each person into account, and it's going to essentially create a schedule or help the administrators create a schedule to minimize fatigue across the board, or for those people that are actually going to be out there on the streets. Now, the recommendations that they've found so far, there's 5 of them. The recommendations that they found so far is the first is going to be to have valid survey instruments to measure fatigue in EMS. And so what they do is what they recommend is sending out quarterly fatigue evaluations. And so essentially it could just be a questionnaire that you fill out, and to kind of measure your fatigue and your happiness levels. And so that's the very first thing that they recommend doing. And that's a way for them to be able to monitor you and your fatigue levels the longer you work at your place of employment. And they recommend doing it, again, quarterly. So you're going to have 4 of these done a year. So if you work for a place for 2 years, you're going to have 8, 3, you're going to have 12. And it's just a way to measure how you're feeling, or how your exhaustion levels. The second step is to get rid of 24-hour shifts. Now, a lot of us probably work 24-hour shifts, 24 on, 48 off, or maybe even 24 on, 72 off. But they believe, and what they've shown is that EMS workers should work less than 24-hour shifts. This could be a 12-hour shift, 8-hour shift, 16-hour shifts. There's lots of different ways to spin it, but they do not recommend anybody work 24-hour shifts, and because that has an increased risk of creating fatigue. Now, the third one is EMS workers should have access to caffeine as a fatigue countermeasure. So whenever you start feeling fatigued, you can get some caffeine. It doesn't care what it is, doesn't matter what type of drink it is, all they care about is that it's caffeine. And it needs to be readily available for you to purchase yourself, or provided to you by your employer. Okay, and that's what it recommends. So it doesn't necessarily say where the caffeine's coming from, just that you have access to it, whether it be through measures of your own or measures put into place by your employer. The fourth recommendation, that is going to be EMS personnel should have the opportunity to nap while on duty to mitigate fatigue. So if it's 6 o'clock in the evening, you can nap. But it doesn't necessarily specify a time for how long the nap should last, or when the naps need to happen. So what it does recommend though is that napping is built into the policies and procedures of your place of employment. That way, there's no repercussions, anything like that, or maybe there's even guidelines for when you can and can't nap. But if you've been running calls all day and you're working a 24-hour shift, it's beneficial for you to be able to nap for at least a little bit while you're on shift. And it doesn't matter if you're working a 24-hour shift, a 12-hour shift, an 8-hour shift. If you've been busy and you're tired, you should be able to nap for a minute, is what it's recommending. The fifth and final recommendation that they have for mitigating fatigue, that's EMS personnel should receive education and training to mitigate fatigue and fatigue-related risk. So essentially, you need to have access to classes and training that is going to provide you with knowledge about fatigue, how to recognize it in yourself and others, what you can do to minimize your risk of fatigue, what you can do if you start feeling fatigued, and just those types of things. And so they have numerical data that they'll look at, and they'll quantify each and every single one of these. And again, that's part of phase 2 is that's testing these recommendations, testing one or more of these recommendations through services that actually want to be able to participate in these studies. So again, this study that was done on fatigue and EMS specifically, it was done by NASEMSO, the National Association of EMS Officials, and it was partnered with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, who runs all EMS things. Now, none of this is necessarily set in stone, but these are the guidelines that they recommend that we put out. And you may see some of these being performed by your employer, you may see none. It's just, this is what NASEMSO is recommending to help minimize fatigue. That way we need to make sure, or that way we're able to make it home at the end of our shift, or we're able to have a good quality of life while we're at work and while we're off work. And you're not spending all your off hours sleeping. And you may have experienced episodes of fatigue yourself, whether it be falling asleep at the wheel while you're on the ambulance, or while you're at home in your personal vehicle, or you're just feeling lethargic and you just don't want to do anything because fatigue is tiredness or exhaustion that's impeding with your normal capacity. And so if you ever experience that, that's going to be that fatigue that they're talking about and that they're aiming to minimize. So I hope that us talking about this, and if you look up the fatigue study that they've done, it's a good read. And but this is what is pertinent right now in the studies about fatigue and EMS.